All right, looks like it's slowed down a little bit, so we will go ahead and get started with our program this evening. So, good evening and welcome to our final Mary Talk of our 8th season. My name is Philip Duggins. I am with the Alumni Engagement Office here at Mary Washington, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We are excited to host a sizable audience for tonight's presentation, which includes alumni, students, parents, and friends from across the country and beyond. As with past lectures, there will be time after the presentation for our guests to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to ask a question by clicking on the Q&A icon below and submitting there, or vote for other submitted questions to help them rise to the top of the list. At this time, I'd like to introduce Amy Filiatro, the UMW University Librarian. Amy, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here as something of a dictionary nerd. And I would like to introduce Dr. Antonio Barrenechea. Dr. Barrenechea is a professor of literature in the Americas and cinema. He received his PhD from Yale University. He is currently writing One Hemisphere, Many Nations, A History of Literature of the Americas as an International Discipline. His first book from 2016, America Unbound, Encyclopedic Literature and Hemispheric, amplified the scope of America across cultures and languages, time, and tradition. He is completing a second book project, Monster, Trash, and Groovy Gothic Cinema of the Americas, which explores the intersection of horror and counterculture in filmmaking capitals of the Western Hemisphere. In 2023, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America awarded him a full scholarship to its yearly Antiquarian Book Seminar. He is also a 2023-2024 Fellow in Book History at the Rare Book School in the University of Virginia. And since you're on this talk, you may be interested in finding him on YouTube in a spotlight series that highlights rare books in UMW's special collections. I will drop a link to that series in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Barrenechea.
So thank you, Amy, Mark, Philip, as well as Angie and Sarah, my colleagues here in Special Collections, who have helped me put this together today. So I join you this evening from Special Collections at the University of Mary Washington to discuss one of the most fascinating and unique books in our collection, Alonso de Molina's Vocabulario en Lengua Mexicana y Castellana from 1571, which I'll shorten to Vocabulario. It is the first bilingual dictionary printed in the Americas. There are two bibliomysteries to solve here. The first pertains to the anatomy of our copy of the Vocabulario. The second is the mystery of how it got into our collection. But first, we must turn to the circumstances of the book's production. We begin in the Age of Discovery, during which, in that fateful year of 1492, Christopher Columbus lands in what cartographers would soon call the Quarta Orbis Pars, or fourth part of the world. This spurred a conquistador gold rush. The most legendary episode in La Conquista is that of the Spaniard Hernán Cortés toppling the Aztec Empire in 1521. In the background here, you see one of a series of 17th century paintings now on display at the Library of Congress. Cortés is on horseback at the right foreground.
Dr. Barrenechea, we're not seeing your PowerPoint.
I'm sharing. Is it up?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So here's the painting of Cortés from the Library of Congress. You see Cortés here on horseback in the foreground in this grand epic battle. The challenge for the Spanish victors was how to incorporate a defeated empire into its own imperial body politic. This was an intense period of debate in Europe surrounding the human rights of indigenous peoples of the Americas. One point of contention was religion. Mexico, in particular, had a most complex pantheon of gods who set the universe in motion, far different than the monotheism of Christianity. Spain established a new viceroyalty to control what it christened Nueva España, New Spain, were the vanquished to be brought into the Christian fold and ruled under the protection of the Spanish royals, or were they natural slaves to be exploited for the extraction of gold and silver from various mines? The answer, in theory, was the first. So, how to bridge the cultural rift? Enter the printing press. By 1450, Johannes Gutenberg had invented printing with movable type. Today, the 1455 Gutenberg Bible is one of the most coveted early printed books from this era, also known as an incunable or incunabulum in Latin. Printing quickly spread throughout Europe, reaching Spain in 1472. To aid the administration of New Spain, the first viceroy signed off on the establishment of the first printing studio in 1539 in Mexico City. It was the first in the Western Hemisphere. The various Catholic orders were a foundation for the new societies. As missionaries, their main task was to bring indigenous communities into the Christian faith. What is lesser known, however, is the manner in which priests served as educators, scholars, translators, encyclopedists, ethnographers, linguists, and beyond. In short, the priests were the intellectual class of the 16th century. The crowning achievement of this period is Historia General de las Cosas de la Nueva España, General History of the Things of New Spain, by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún. The 12-volume masterwork is a product of close collaboration with conquered indigenous peoples. A seminal book published during this period is Alonso de Molina's Vocabulario from 1555. This is the official first edition of the monumental 1571 edition I shall discuss during the remainder of this talk. I consulted this book in 3 copies at the Library of Congress. It is a one-way dictionary from Spanish into Nahuatl. While Molina's achievement is vast, it would lead to his more complete, more accessible, and more robust second edition of 1571. This one. What follows is a general description of the Vocabulario, not limited to our copy at UMW. The book is 11.5 inches tall, 8.25 inches wide, and 1.75 inches thick. It consists of 280 folio sheets. There are 39,100 word entries from Nahuatl to Spanish and vice versa, combined, making it a two-way dictionary, unlike the first edition from 1555, which only went one way. There are 4 columns per sheet, recto and verso. Here you see the beginning of the A's in the Nahuatl to Spanish section. This continues on the back in alphabetical order. Decorated letters greet the reader at each new heading. Let's put the dictionary to work using an important word to aid the evangelical purpose of Molina's dictionary. Molina translates the Nahuatl word tlacatecolot here as demonio or diablo, demon or devil. Searched in reverse, the Spanish word diablo shows up as tlacatecolot alongside some Nahua variants. Such cross-cultural meetings on the printed page document an evolving Latin American consciousness that combines Spanish and indigenous agents. The Spanish-born Molina used native collaborators for his dictionary, but these go uncredited. Molina dedicates his vocabulario to the second viceroy of New Spain, Luis de Velasco. This customary gesture comes in the form of a letter at the start of the book. Velasco was the on-site representative of the Spanish Empire and oversaw political and economic affairs. His job included licensing printings, including books by Molina. There is one prologue to the reader per section of the book. These contain theoretical ponderings, such as a recounting of the Tower of Babel episode from Genesis, the basis for the creation of world languages and the confusion of tongues. Molina also includes observations on Spanish grammar, the agglutinative nature of Nahuatl, and problems of orthography for an indigenous language with no written alphabet. Practical advice to the reader on how to access the entries rounds out the two prologues. At the end of dictionary halves, the vocabulario includes woodcut engravings of Christian symbols. The first of these is an indigenous man kneeling in a field in prayer. It is a Mexican precursor to the praying Indian images of New England. The second is a Christogram with initials. The colophon at the end of the book shows the printer's seal and furnishes the publication details. Spanish and Nahuatl appear above and below the shield, respectively. This symmetrical display indicates the extent to which the vocabulario is the first bilingual foundation for users from both sides. It recognizes and preserves the Aztec tongue. Finally, there appears one title page per dictionary half. The first features a woodcut engraving of the Viceroy's coat of arms. The second is of St. Francis of Assisi, founder of the Franciscan order, with the usual marks of stigmata, poverty, and devotion. But you will notice that my images come from different copies of the same book. So what gives? Let's solve our first bibliomystery. I consulted 6 copies of the 1571 Vocabulario. These came, respectively, from the Catholic University of America, the Library of Congress, Dumbarton Oaks, Georgetown University, the University of Virginia, and the University of Mary Washington. These differ in binding, condition, and completeness. Among the most interesting is the thin copy from Dumbarton Oaks, which includes only one half of the book. This abridgment gives a sense of the Vocabulario's afterlife, how some of its pages could have been dispersed and rebound over the centuries. The most fascinating, however, is the Georgetown copy, which has marginalia in a second indigenous language, attesting to its historical use across multiple Mexican communities. The UMW copy is unique among these copies for having been sophisticated to appear perfect. A sophisticated book is one that has been restored to increase its value. The term implies deceit. UMW's copy of the Vocabulario features the same title page from a second donor copy to fill in for the lack of the first title page with the shield. This one. We should not be seeing double here. Close comparison with the 5 other area copies I consulted corrected my vision and solved this first mystery of the book's strange anatomy. More evidence of repairs. Notice a short page 16 filling in for a missing leaf on the left. The center image shows triple mounting. The repair has taken over one of the final fly leaves in the book, reinforced it with a shorter leaf from a donor copy, and then glued the surviving original leaf on top of both. For reference, the image on the right is of a facsimile title page tipped into the Dumbarton Oaks copy. It is proof of how such a page might go missing from rough use or theft, which was common with old maps in particular. Asking who made the repairs and why leads us into bibliomystery number 2. Provenance refers to a book's unique chain of custody. By ascertaining the provenance, we gain a working sense of a book's historical impact on its owners and of its circle of influence. What we know for sure is the following. The Vocabulario was born in the printing studio or Casa de Antonio de Espinosa. Here you see a detail of his name from the title page. Spinoza was the best regarded printer of 16th century Mexico. His studio once stood next to the Templo de San Agustin in Mexico City's historic core. Next, we pick up the vocabulario in the 18th century. We come before a very curious leaf whose tantalizing secrets we can barely grasp. Behind this stain on the left is a canceled annotation. At the top, we can make out a ghostly script that begins with Año de 1771, year of 1771. Given the nature of the vocabulario, the date of the markings, and verifiable ownership marks I've seen in other copies, I believe these were likely made by a devout reader in a church, convent, or monastery. Interestingly, the annotations come exactly 200 years after the book's 1571 publication. Does it in some way commemorate its bicentennial? And why was it canceled? And by whom? I don't know. We jump forward to the period of Mexican independence. As in the United States, the Mexican founding fathers were Enlightenment-inspired idealists who believed in democracy and individual rights. The war against Spain lasted from 1810 through 1821. Nation-building institutions emerged in its wake. One of these was the Sociedad Mexicana de Geografía y Estadística, hereafter SMGE. First scientific society in the Americas, its scholars measured the contours of the new Mexican nation through scientific means. Our vocabulario includes a proprietary stamp from the SMGE. This era was also anti-clerical, even expropriating church property. I can imagine the vocabulario going from an object of spiritual conversions in the field into an object of study for a new class of enlightened secular scholars, who would have been, no doubt, the priests 2 centuries earlier. We enter the 20th century through an annotated front flyleaf. The notes are copious and learned, but they have been written directly on the book, an act of borderline defacement for an antiquarian bookseller at the time. The ornate cursive strokes and pencil cite several 19th century bibliographic sources for the vocabulario, in French and in English. They remind us that it was once thought to be, erroneously, the first book printed in the Americas. The handwriting proclaims this copy, quote, an American incunable in its contemporary Mexican binding, exclamation point, end quote. While in Europe, an incunable is a book printed before 1500, in an American context, it denotes a Spanish language book before 1600. The description in a third paragraph notes, quote, fire, vandalism, and worming have all left their mark. But the book is a tall copy with only essentially slight loss of text, unquote. And then my favorite part of the description, quote, one of the earliest New World printings, the Bay Psalms book, a much later and more paltry northern attempt, unquote. I love this, not so much because it pulls rank on the New England printing press established almost a century later in 1620. Rather, it shows inter-American literary historical thinking, my field of study, by a bookseller sometime around 1950. There is also a reference here to a release ad from the SMGE. This indicates that the person trying to sell the book now had kept a record of sale. The fact that the SMGE release ad appeared in English and called the book a, quote, must, unquote, in any collection of Americana, and, quote, excessively rare, perfect or imperfect, unquote, makes the target an overseas book collector, this coming as early as the 1930s, when a second wave of anti-clericalism accompanied the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s. The vocabulario almost certainly crossed the border to sell at a US rare book auction in New York City. Finally, the seller's description mentions a tipped-in map. I believe the same seller stuck it into the book in order to generate more interest among a buyer, local buyer. The facsimile illustration is taken from a mid-century Anglophone history book. It provides a view of the capital city of Tenochtitlan after the Spanish conquest. Church steeples dot the busy skyline where Aztec temples with their gods once stood. The buyer, and this is the part that cost me the most work, I think, but I loved every bit of it, really. The buyer, acting as an antiquarian bookseller himself on his own behalf here, was Paul W. Schmidtchen. He was a collector from New Jersey and the author of Martial Airs, a 1961 book of war poetry. He laid an armorial bookplate onto the paste down, the marbled paper perhaps dating to when the book was repaired by SMGE. I found a writing sample for confirmation. Notice Schmidtchen's odd use of the capital E in the middle of words. Yet, not 3 hours ago, his daughter-in-law emailed me, describing him as, quote, a brilliant and eccentric man, unquote, and an avid collector from the 1930s to the 1950s. Schmidtchen pasted in a decorative second plate with a quote from Erasmus, quote, when I get a little money, I buy books, and if any is left, I buy food and clothing, unquote. No doubt it's charming, but the edition threatens the book's market value. This same eccentric once owned a 1599 Geneva Bible, now at a Japanese university. His daughter-in-law writes that he accumulated historical curiosities, quote, furniture, including the door to the Bastille, Columbus's bed, George Washington's sideboard, paintings, especially portraits of famous historical figures, Asian and American objets d'art, medieval stained glass windows depicting the Niña Pinta y Santa Maria, and Egyptian sarcophagus, to name a few pieces, unquote. We near the end of the line with Dr. Gordon Jones, a local OBGYN from the Fredericksburg area. He was known as an enthusiastic collector of rare books on Virginia history, medical subjects in the English Renaissance. Jones maintained a valuable library at home. His letterhead, pictured here, boasts an image of his book room. Jones was not only a collector, but a rare book evangelist of sorts. Among his many bibliophile activities, Jones served as an outside member of the Rare Book Committee at Mary Washington College in advance of the opening of the Rare Book Room in Trinkle Hall, now James Farmer Hall, where I currently teach a course on rare books connected to tonight's lecture. I believe he bought or traded for the Vocabulario from Schmidtchen in the mid-1950s. Yet ultimately, the book was outside his collecting focus, and we benefited. Jones donated several valuable antiquarian books to Mary Washington throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Here I offer you a brief and tantalizing glimpse of a beautiful hand-colored Italian edition of Tasso's epic poem, Jerusalem Delivered, from 1590, perhaps a topic for a future lecture. I have pinned down a partial record of Jones's gift of the Vocabulario within university archives. In a letter dated December 6, 1960, university librarian Carol Kenzel writes in response to Jones, quote, we are delighted to have this copy of an excessively rare incunabulum to place without defacement in our proposed rare book room, unquote. Most interesting here are the words without defacement. I believe Jones ultimately disliked the incompleteness of the Vocabulario he had purchased or traded for. He was bothered by the Erasmus sticker in Schmidtchen's ad on the flyleaf. I imagine he asked Kenzel to avoid further, quote unquote, defacement through library markings, and that Kenzel is repeating his words back to him here in confirmation and in gratitude. The book entered our collection just after the 50th anniversary of the college. The Vocabulario officially moved into the rare book room of Mary Washington College of the University of Virginia in 1963. As such, the first printed dictionary of the Western Hemisphere, completed its journey from a printing studio in the heart of the Spanish-American Empire to Thomas Jefferson's self-proclaimed Empire of Liberty. The third U.S. president and the founder of UVA, Jefferson also laid the cornerstone for an empire of print books at the Library of Congress, the largest in the Americas. From Mexico City to the DMV, our vocabulario confronts us with a secret history of circulation, material embodiments, languages, devotions, and print cultures. I hope you have enjoyed tracing some of its many escapades with me this evening. Thank you. And if I may, just one final slide, one final thing here. If you want to learn more about the history of rare book collecting at Mary Washington, I invite you to read my short history on the Special Collections website up on the screen. At the bottom of that page, you'll find my bio with a link to a series of YouTube videos shot and edited by my former student, Nick Honorato. In these videos, I give 5-minute spotlight views of books in our collection. I'm happy to take your questions now and also answer any bibliophile inquiries after the lecture. Perhaps you'd like a tour of our collection, wish to donate a book, or are eager to identify a certain edition of a book in your possession. I'm happy to serve as a faculty liaison on behalf of UMW.
Great, thank you. So once again, as a reminder, for those of you that may have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and then you'll type your question in there. So we do have the first question that's been entered from Alice. Is there any documentation processing of who donates rare or valuable books? It's always interesting when a donor is anonymous and gives priceless work. There is probably always a story behind how they acquired the books. Did you come across any interesting donor stories during your research?
Yeah, so one of the most enjoyable parts of this was just how a lot of it came together at the very end, meaning this last week. The armorial book plate that you have from Schmidtchen was something that I couldn't figure out until I think last Sunday. And once I cracked through that, then I was able to go back and figure out who this guy was, and figured out he was a published author. And then that led me to actually place a telephone call to a school in New Jersey where he had been superintendent, and the person there, put me in contact with somebody else, who in turn put me in contact with his daughter-in-law, which has been just fabulous. She's a wonderful woman. I'm going to share this talk with her, and she just gave me so much information about how, Paul Schmidtchen would go to New York City from New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey too, so I find this really fascinating. From New Jersey, go into New York City, and just the kind of things that he was able to assemble during the Great Depression. I think he must have had a really interesting. A lot of interest, and certainly a very good eye. He really liked association things, so things that were associated with historical peoples. I think there's more. There's more to know and more to learn about Paul. I think, and he was like my great mystery at the end there, figuring out, what drove him to it. When exactly he acquired the thing, and when he pasted the book plate on it, and when he may have sold it. And I think I have a clearer picture of that. That's one of the big sort of eccentric collectors. The other one is of course, Gordon Jones, who I know much more about him because his information about him is all over our archives, and he was really seminal in getting that room that you're seeing in that slide open, which is where I teach my course right now. He was an important, I think, an influential figure. He was an outside figure, but he was still, I think, a great influence on the people in the early 1960s who were putting together a rare book room at Mary Washington College. So yeah, there are records, but sometimes they're harder to find than others. And sometimes, pick up the phone, call somebody, and you get your answers there. So.
Okay, next question is, how common is forgery in the rare books world?
Gosh, I wouldn't know how to put a percentage on that. I've seen, from my work with rare book dealers through the CAP seminar that Amy mentioned. I've seen examples of forged books that are just very well forged, right? Where these rare book dealers who sort of put together this program to train other rare book dealers. They use them as samples, so that they're that good, right? That you can see that you have to kind of sometimes even tell something that if a book itself has been counterfeited, sometimes it's the weight that gives it away, the weight of the paper and the sum of the weight. Forgeries themselves, as far as signatures, that's another matter. I don't know the answer to that. Of course, it's signatures can be forged, can be fake. I think maybe also the question surrounding that has to do with the perfected, the sophisticated copy that we have here. For a long time, I couldn't tell. To me, it just looked like two of the same frontispieces of the title pages in our copy. And it was only when I started to look at other copies and I went, whoa, what is this? And I realized, oh man, we've been had, something's changed here. And then that kind of led me in that direction. But so I think, it's like any other business, I suppose. It's always, you have to be informed. And I think with books, sometimes, I'll say one more thing. I'm going on too long, but I will say that, a lot of books sort of disappeared from Mexico, right, in different periods of time. So, for example, during the 20th Century Revolution, when, churches were being cleared out and my understanding from talking to a lot of different scholars is that a lot of these books wound up in Americana collections in the United States. I think that's a kind of an untold story of sort of like black market type channels. And I'm not suggesting that that's the case here. I think we have a record of we have enough sufficient record to know where this came from, right? The different people involved. But yeah, I think forgery is more common than you think.
Okay. Next question. What would you recommend doing if you think you have a valuable book in your home and want to donate it? Is there a specific process?
I would start with contacting me. I mean, I think, and we can kind of take it from there. We can, I can talk to the special collections librarian certainly, and we can make a determination about, if it's something that, we think that we could use. Now, let me just give you a sense of that. So, of course, there's so many interesting books out there, right? In some cases, it might be a book that fits into our established collection. So, for example, our collection in James Joyce is really strong because it just happened to be the thing that was collected. We have an incredible collection of James Joyce materials, so much so that I think, scholars should know that this is a place, this small college is a place to come in and study Joyce and work with materials. So let's say somebody were to donate a Joyce book that sort of fits into that parameter, wonderful, right? Whereas maybe another type of book that might not fit into our collecting parameters in any way might be better donated somewhere else. So there is a procedure, and we're working on sort of coming up with clear guidelines for that. But I would start with maybe connecting me, taking it from there. So.
Okay, here's a comment from our friend Jack Bales. He says the book The Scholar Adventures by Richard Altick has a nice chapter on famous literary forgeries. Thank you for that, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.
Okay. But ask if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat as we've gotten to the kind of the end of the lists right now. So give it just one more second for folks that may be typing furiously. Oh, here we go. How effective scholarly is this dictionary as a record of the indigenous language in question? Do we know?
Sorry, what's the question again? How effective
scholarly is this dictionary as a record of the indigenous language in question? Do we know?
Oh, okay, you're right. So yeah, I mean, it's a dictionary that was used up through the 19th century. So it had a certain kind of weight. It was used. Having said that, and I'm glad that somebody asked this question because I didn't have time to go into this. I was more concerned with the materiality of the book and its travels. But the book itself is based off of a Spanish language grammar, right? And that grammar is itself it's Spanish to Latin, right? And so this book by Molina actually carries over some of the concern with Latin as well. So you do get some curious inclusions of terminology that wouldn't necessarily show up. Like my understanding is that the words for like Roman senator are in this book. So you do get a sense of the kind of like the clunky kind of imposition, right? From sort of the Spanish concern for its own language, right? Irrespective of this new Nahuatl language that they were confronted with. But having said all that, I think it was considered a scholarly source, through the 19th century. And it's at this point, I would say it's more respected as a kind of piece of Mexican patrimony, right? Like the Mexican heritage. But it's not the kind of book that gets sort of dismissed offhand. I mean, it is the first of its kind. And it seems to be such a strong foundation for whatever came after it that it's, that it is one to consult. It's also, keep in mind that, as a dictionary, it's also like on the ground at the time, right? It's when you have a multitude of Nahuatl speakers, in a way that, you would now. So that's also important, that it has a presence, in the field at the time. And that also raises its value, even when there is a kind of, iffiness around like specific, scholarly matters. Right?
Okay. Next question is, do you have any suggestions on storing rare books in order to preserve them better?
Well, I mean, the standard here is, not too much humidity, not too cold, not too hot. It's certainly not in any environment that's going to kind of go back and forth. Here, I'll show you an example of this. Our beautiful copy of the Tasso, for example, can you see that? So it has what we call bowing, which is when like the problem with this, I think, is over the centuries, when it was stored in a bookshelf, it was probably squeezed a little too tight in this area. And then just like the breathing of the book, right, has created this kind of effect where it looks like it's fanning out. It's fanning out like that. And so, that's an example of what happens when you don't store something properly in the right environment. But having said that, this is a very nice, good condition for this particular book and this particular age. But that's the kind of thing. So you don't want too much heat. You don't want too much. You don't want extreme weather, extreme temperature rather. Wherever you store books. The books I have, whatever books I have, I keep them in the basement. Again, there's flooding, there's the possibility there too, but that's where I like to keep them, because my wife likes to keep it a little too hot in the house. And, so.
Okay. The next question, were you able to travel to see these other versions? If not, how were you able to access them?
So I accessed every one of those copies that I saw, that I put up here, the LOC, the Library of Congress copies. If you notice, they're all regional, so I was able to access them. I think the furthest one was like, well, I guess it would have been UVA, but I was at UVA for because I'm a fellow, I'm a rare book fellow right now, and so it was there for me to access while I was taking courses there. The other copies, I just moved from Washington D.C. into Fredericksburg, so when I was in D.C., I was able to go to Catholic and Georgetown and so on, right, and Dumbarton Oaks. So all of those copies I accessed in person. I have my pictures, and I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to use for this or not, so I took lots and lots and lots of pictures. But what's kind of cool is, like, with rare books and archival work, is like you're touching things, you're handling them, and at some point it becomes like an old friend. Just feel like it's so familiar, right? And so I think that sense of familiarity it really fascinates me at this point in my career. I think that's one of the ways in which the humanities can sort of be revived a bit to matter, right? By tending to the physical matter of books and their lives, the lives they've led historically and such. And how I access them is simply, people don't realize, because rare book archives, rare book rooms, certain fancy kind of university libraries could be very intimidating, but really it's a matter of reaching out to a special collections librarian and saying, look, I know you have this in your collection, can I have a look at it? And this is sort of a procedure and a protocol that, for how you do that. But I found that for the most part that they've been very receptive to my work and my interest. And there are books that I've accessed that I wasn't working on. I've looked at several editions of Ulysses, the first edition, because we happen to have one, and I wanted to compare with others, right? And it just becomes a thing that you do. That's something that you're interested in. So.
Okay. Next question. For amateur aspiring researchers, what advice would you give for doing research on a rare book or document?
Well, I would probably first figure out where there are copies. If you go to WorldCat, CAT, you could sort of see what copies, how many copies there are, and what libraries it might be in, and kind of sort of start sort of start going about figuring out how to do a route or something, and getting to see that first copy, getting that first acquaintance, right? And then if that's something that you're interested in researching further, you might look at another copy, or you might look at other books that are related to that copy. One of the things that's amazing is, the more and more I look at these books in different centuries, the more familiar they are, right? And so it gets to a point where you put a book in my hand and I can kind of just sense what it is. And yeah, I'm still wrong. I was wrong about the handwriting, for example, that I wound up figuring it was the 50s. I thought it was earlier. So there are details, there are things, right? But you also have, I have, contacts in the rare book trade. I have contacts, professors and librarians as well. And so among all of us, right? And again, just picking up the phone and calling the woman who was, Paul's daughter-in-law was so gracious. She was so happy to know that somebody cared about a book that had once belonged to Paul, Paul, right? And so that also, right? It's not just scholarly sources or the know-it-alls, right? But it's also just people who who have a recollection, right? So it becomes almost like oral history or something. So all of those, I like this because it involves all those things, as well as serendipity, right? There's also this element of just luck. Like if I had given this talk 5 days ago, I wouldn't have had the information I have now. I'm currently in conversation with the SMGE, which is a librarian at the SMGE, which is that Mexican institute that had the stamp. They put the stamp on it, and I'm trying to figure out when they got it and when they sold it. So I'm still, if this talk was maybe 2 weeks from now, I'd have an answer for you or a more complete picture. I don't have that, but I do want to find out. So,
Next question is, do donors ever receive payment for donations, or are they always donations with no financial strings attached?
That'd be a question for our special collections librarian. My sense is probably that the donation might come with the stipulation, for example, that you wouldn't be able to break up a collection. So let's say that the donor was to donate like a collection of Virginiana, like books about Virginia, early books about Virginia, or something like that. There might be a legal contract that you can't break those up, right? So based on that, the collection will be accepted or not, right? The payment, I don't think that's a thing, really. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I think it's more maybe about, like it's attributed to you. It has your plate in it or information about you as the donor, something like that. Those are the two I'm aware of, right? Sort of like the attribution and also the other case of not breaking up your collection, because collectors, even when they're gone, right, they want their stuff to stick together sometimes. Some people are more sensitive about their stuff being dispersed. And if a library already has a copy of a certain book, they're not necessarily going to want a second one. So how do you feel about that? That's a question. So much of my course in rare books, we started off this semester. So much of it was about sort of collectors thinking about, where their stuff goes, when they get a certain age, so, inquiring into where things come from is also sort of a confrontation with mortality in some way, right? Of these different people involved along the way.
So if I could jump in as the university librarian, we are investigating trying to establish a budget for our special collections rare books purchasing. So there is a potential for that. We would need to make sure that it is within our collection priorities and that it is something that we are interested in purchasing. So there is a potential for that.
But then that wouldn't be donated, right? It's sold to a, of course,
Correct.
collections are sold.
That would be a sale.
That's right. That's right.
And that would be rare. We typically do not do that.
Any other questions before we wrap up this evening? Okay. All right. Well, not seeing any at this point. Thank you, Antonio, for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank Mark Simpkins from Events AV, who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of tonight's program. And thanks again to our viewers at home for joining us and being a part of the conversation. Remember that this presentation will be available for viewing on the UMW YouTube channel by this time next week. There you can watch this program and browse the full catalog of Mary Talks. Our 9th season of Mary Talks will kick off on September 25th and will feature Dr. Stephen Farnsworth, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs, talking about the upcoming election. Keep an eye out for more information for our next presentation in August. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier, and thank you so much. Have a good evening.